They abandoned me at the airport, not knowing I'd already taken everything back. They thought the signature was surrender. They thought leaving an old man at gate B12 was freedom. But the house they stole had already chosen its owner, and the deed they celebrated was never theirs to keep. By the time the plane door closed, Justice had already boarded another flight. He woke before the birds because old habits keep better time than clocks. Kettle on. Curtains parted. Thumb on the radio dial until the voice that sounded most like a neighbor took the room. He walked the hall, pressing a palm once to the framed photo of his wife the way some people touch door frames for luck. The house greeted him in its usual places. The soft click of the pantry latch that needed a taller screw. The friendly groan from the third stair. The rectangle of sun that slid across the kitchen table like a punctual guest. Harold Whitman did not call this place property. He called it proof. 46 years. One mortgage burned behind the shed on a night so cold the smoke refused to climb. A maple out back that had shaded first birthdays and last conversations. He could point to a scuff and tell you which year it happened and why it mattered. He could open the tool cabinet in the garage with his eyes closed and reach the exact wrench by memory of rust. His son Daniel said the word asset the way a realtor says opportunity. Daniel used to run through the sprinkler in this yard and swallow apology cookies hot from a tray he'd bumped. Now he wore a smartwatch that buzzed him away from his own sentences. His wife Rebecca came too, always with a good coat and a good reason. Her compliments were precise, like measurements disguised as kindness. "This light is amazing," she'd say in the front room, eyes moving, already arranging imaginary furniture that cost more than stories. They visited on schedule. "We'll swing by Saturday, Dad." Swing by. As if visits were errands with parking validation. They brought pastries and the aura of people who have 12 more places to be. He brewed coffee, not out of obligation, but because coffee let him ask about their lives without sounding like a noise complaint. "How are the projects?" he would say. "The same," Daniel would answer, tapping his watch to silence a ghost. "Bigger, faster." "And you?" he'd ask Rebecca. She'd smile the way people smile when they're about to offer help they already priced. "Just trying to make sure everyone's taking care of themselves." It started small, the way every storm begins with a temperature you don't notice. A brochure on the table. A casual mention of a community, with fountains and transport and identical smiles. "Independent living, Dad," Rebecca said, spreading glossy pages like a card trick. "Just look at the amenities." "I've got amenities," Harold said, nodding toward the back door where the maple kept time. "Shade, quiet, and neighbors who remember my name without a clipboard." They laughed as if he were charming. Week by week, concern turned into script. "The taxes," Daniel said, drawing numbers with steam on his coffee cup. "The upkeep," Rebecca added, setting her phone on the table so the camera could see the crown molding. "If something happened," they said together as if rehearsed. Something had happened. Marjorie. He learned to say her name in past tense without setting the room on fire. He learned to fix the leaky sink without announcing it to a witness. He learned that loneliness doesn't always cry. Sometimes it just labels your shelves. He did not argue with numbers. He argued with meaning. "I get the mail by noon," he said. "I still climb a ladder before it gets cocky. I peel potatoes at the shelter on Thursdays. Who's this a problem for?" "That's not fair," Daniel said, because fairness often means please accept my plan. "We worry about you." "Worry with me," Harold said softly. "Don't plan over me." They brought paperwork next, softened by phrases that make pens move. "Streamline, protect, avoid hassle." "Just preliminary," Rebecca said, offering a folder heavy with tabs. "We'll loop in a lawyer friend to walk you through." "No pressure." He set the folder beside the radio and watered the plants. After they left, he opened it. He read the parts people assume old men won't read. He circled verbs. He underlined a line that used the word transfer like a compliment. Then he slid the folder into the desk and took out a thinner one with Marjorie's handwriting on the tab, Contingency B. Inside, a half page of things she wanted if the worst version of people ever came through the door. Keep the maple standing. Feed somebody. Don't let money talk like it's the truth. He touched the loop of her G and felt steadier. Call number 1 went to Sandra Kell, a retired attorney who still wore her hair like she had a meeting in 10 minutes. Harold knew her from the veterans' breakfast, where she asked better questions than politicians and left before the photos. "You remembered me," she said when she picked up. "You argued about coffee refills with Grace," he said. "I need that kind of law." They met at her one-room office over the hardware store. No candles that smelled like forests, no framed Latin, just a clean desk and a legal pad that had already made up its mind to take notes. He told her the situation without drama. He did not beg for sympathy. He asked for structure. She slid him a printed sheet. "Life estate," she said. "You keep the home as long as you breathe. No one can shuffle you anywhere. When you go, this place can move where your values already live." He nodded. "And if someone tries to speed the process or treat me like luggage?" She tapped her pen. "Then we write a trigger clause even a sleepy judge can see in the dark." They wrote. The trust took shape with the efficiency of a well-packed bag. The beneficiaries were exactly who the house would have named if houses could sign. The shelter kitchen on Elm that turned grocery store bruises into soup. A tools scholarship at the community college for hands that fix rather than toss. And a conservation covenant for the maple that had held 3 generations of July. The clause read plain as a street sign. Neglect, coercion, or abandonment by any would-be manager voided their rights. Evidence could be notably ordinary: timestamps, receipts, footage, statements. Paper doesn't need to shout when it can point. Sandra underlined the last line. "You're sure you want this?" she asked, not for effect but for record. "I'm sure," he said. "I'd rather disappoint greed than disappoint her." They booked the courthouse slot. Wednesday morning, 10:15. He wore the navy jacket Marjorie called his honest suit. The clerk with the chipped pink nail polish walked him through each page with the patience of someone who has watched families save themselves and watched them fail. The notary's stamp pressed down like a small, dignified finality. He paid, thanked, folded, and stepped into a morning so clear even the flag outside looked newly washed. That afternoon, Daniel called with a voice borrowed from commercials. "We're taking you out Friday," he announced. "Big dinner. You've been so brave about planning, time to celebrate." Celebrate. The word had perfect teeth. Harold said yes. He did not add the part about already having celebrated at the courthouse by eating a sandwich on the steps and letting the sun get away with being kind. He spent Thursday doing the kind of chores that make Friday feel less dangerous. He oiled the back door hinge so it would stop trying to sing. He replaced the bathroom bulb that flickered like a nervous lie. He scrubbed the sink until it looked like a photograph of itself. Under the sink, taped to the interior of the cabinet, he left a letter printed large enough for any future finder to read without squinting. It said, "If you're reading this because I'm gone, make soup for strangers here." Friday came dressed like a promise. Early light on the porch rail. Early light on the porch rail. A breeze that found the chimes without shaking them. He showered, shaved, and chose the shirt that had outlived his most stubborn stain. He slid the trust copies into the inside pocket and, for no reason except ritual, tucked in the wedding day photo. On the back, in thin ink, Marjorie had once written, "Remember to be the man you promised to be when your tie was too tight." The restaurant was new money bright. Chandeliers pretending to be constellations hovered over people who spoke in accomplished murmurs. The host said welcome back, though Harold had never been there. Maybe he said it to everyone. Maybe the place taught its employees to speak in prophecy. They hugged him like people who wanted the photo to look like love. Bread arrived. Wine arrived. Laughter arrived on cue. Rebecca raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said. "New beginnings," Daniel echoed, with eyes that watched the folder peeking from the waiter's apron like a magician's silk. Harold raised his glass and aimed for harmless. "To doing things right," he said. The papers landed the way papers land when people expect obedience. Tabs, flags, signatures marked with arrows that said sign here, as if there were no other places to sign in the world. "It's just to make everything smoother," Daniel said. "We'll manage the little stuff so you can finally relax." "Just housekeeping," Rebecca said. "And you trust us, of course." He read. Not because he needed to. He had already handled the truth that morning, but because reading in front of them turned their rush into a mirror. He signed where it was safe to sign. His hand did not tremble. He had trembled enough for one lifetime in places where paper didn't help. Dessert suggested itself. They agreed. Coffee came in cups that forced you to sit up straight. Rebecca checked her phone and slid it face down, the universal gesture of someone who would rather control than be caught. Ready, Daniel said as soon as the plates. We have a surprise. Airport, Rebecca said, smiling like she'd solved generosity. Airport? He repeated, polite as a coat check. A little trip we planned, Daniel said. You need a break. We'll handle the house while you're gone. No stress. He looked at the two of them, their relief at their own idea, the way their shoulders lowered because they believed the hard part was over. He looked past them at the street through the window, at the ordinary gray of a city minding its business. He imagined telling them the truth in the middle of a restaurant that taught forks to behave. He didn't. He let the scene keep its furniture. All right, he said, standing. Let's see the surprise. They drove in the sweet spot between rush hours, when traffic yawns and the city pretends to be easy. Conversation stayed in its lane. Sports scores, weather, how construction always seems to find the same streets. No one said the word deed. No one said the word trust. They filled the car with noises that wouldn't testify. At departures, Daniel popped the trunk and performed ceremony, lifting the bag Rebecca had packed into view, giving it the heft of a gift. Rebecca adjusted his collar and dabbed an invisible smudge from his sleeve with a cloth that told on her preparation. Text us when you land, she said. Where am I landing? He asked, friendly, curious, like the old version of himself who used to let surprises win. You'll like it, Daniel said, already halfway into the driver's seat. Just go to B12. They'll take care of you. They slid the car back into the ribbon of red brake lights, absorbed quickly like a lie in a crowd. He watched until they were not a car anymore, just traffic. Inside, the airport did what airports do, turned everyone into the same story for a while. Shoes off. Bins. Belts. Apologies to strangers for being humans with pockets. He moved cleanly, an expert in shared rules. At the gate, he found a chair with a view of wings and ground crews in fluorescent vests writing choreography with their arms. He set his coat over his knees. He breathed until his pulse matched the rolling announcement voice that told families where to stand. He thought about the oven he had turned off twice. He thought about the maple and the scholarship in the kitchen on Elm. He thought about Marjorie's note. Remember to be the man. Then he put his phone on airplane mode and sat in the peace only a good plan earns. The phone would start ringing later. They would learn quickly there was nothing in the house to list, insure, or stage without him. The bank would ask for a signature it already knew. The county would pull up a deed with a clause that didn't care about their impatience. A camera would timestamp a curbside goodbye that lasted exactly 38 seconds. But that belonged to later. An old man waiting at gate B12, coat folded, a boarding pass with someone else's idea of freedom printed on it, and a quiet that wasn't surrender at all. He looked at the jetway and smiled like a person who has already decided what the next scene will feel like. The overhead lights dimmed as another boarding group shuffled past. He sat still, watching reflections of strangers drift across the glass. Airports have their own kind of night, half machine, half heartbeat. Every sound carries somewhere else. The soft murmur of engines, the scuff of luggage wheels, the polite announcements of destinations he didn't need. His phone vibrated again and again, the screen flashing with names he'd already forgiven but wasn't yet ready to hear. He switched it off, slipped it into his coat, and stood. The boarding door hissed closed behind the last passenger. For a moment he watched his own face in the window, calm, lined, ordinary. He thought of Marjorie's phrase whenever life turned cruel, let the river bring it back. He turned toward the exit instead of the gate. Outside, the parking lot smelled like rain on concrete. He hailed a cab, the driver's face a blur of tired kindness. Home, he said, and leaned back as the city slid by. Lights blinked on the horizon like old memories that refused to die. Somewhere in those lights his son was pouring wine, rehearsing relief, planning renovations. The ride took 40 minutes. Every mile between the airport and his porch felt like the turning of a page. He paid double the fare and told the driver to keep the change. Generosity, he'd learned, is never wasted, even when it isn't deserved. The porch light glowed as he approached, steady and golden. He unlocked the door and stepped into the smell of his own life, dust, pine soap, and faint coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and waited for the first vibration. It came just after midnight. Then another. Then 3 at once. The phone on the counter trembled like a caught insect. He let it buzz until the sound turned absurd. When it finally stopped, silence filled the house again. Thick, clean, almost holy. He poured himself a drink, not whiskey this time but warm tea. Whiskey was for forgetting. Tea was for staying sharp enough to remember. Across town the celebration had soured. The lawyer friend Rebecca trusted had begun reading the deed. Daniel's name was there, yes, but so was a sentence he hadn't noticed. It was one of those plain sentences that ruin entire evenings. This agreement remained subordinate to all pre-existing life and trust instruments executed by Harold Whitman and recorded in county records. What does that mean? Rebecca had asked. The lawyer looked at her with the patient pity of a man delivering a weather report. It means you don't own anything yet. Maybe never. They had driven home in silence. The closer they got to the house, the heavier the air became, like guilt learning to breathe. Harold knew the sound of his son's car before it turned the corner. Tires whispered up the driveway. Headlights carved through the blinds. Then came the knock, frantic and uncoordinated. He let them knock twice more before opening the door. The porch light caught their faces. Daniel pale, Rebecca wide-eyed, mascara like smudged punctuation. Dad, what's going on? Daniel's voice cracked between authority and panic. They said the deed doesn't count. They said. They're right, Harold said. He stepped aside and gestured them in. The house felt smaller with them inside, like it had shrunk away from their noise. Rebecca paced. Daniel sat, elbows on knees, the picture of a man realizing the cost of cleverness. You went behind our backs, Rebecca snapped. After we helped you. Helped. He tilted his head, calm as a teacher correcting a child. Leaving a man at an airport is an odd kind of help. We were giving you a trip. He smiled. You gave me clarity. Daniel rubbed his forehead. You made us look like criminals. I didn't make you look like anything, Harold said. You chose your own lighting. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the trust, each page crisp, deliberate. You'll see there's no trickery. Everything's legal, filed, notarized. I still live here until I don't. When that day comes, this house feeds people who need it. The shelter. The school. The kitchen downtown. Rebecca's mouth opened, but no words came out. Daniel looked at the papers like they were ashes. Dad, we didn't mean to hurt you. Then learn from it, Harold said. Don't repeat it when someone trusts you next time. He stood, walked to the counter and refilled the kettle. The sound of boiling filled the pause. I'm making tea, he said. You're welcome to stay until you remember how to speak kindly. They didn't. They left without finishing their apologies. He watched their car fade down the street. The quiet that returned wasn't lonely, it was earned. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the porch steps like forgiveness. He spent the early hours trimming the hedge and fixing the loose latch on the garden gate. His body moved easily. The house itself had decided to help. Around 10, he heard the mail carrier's truck stop at the curb. Among the envelopes was one from the bank, confirming the trust transfer and the new account for community disbursement. Beneath that, a handwritten letter from the shelter director. Your generosity came at the perfect time. The stove finally works again. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that starts in the chest and never reaches the lips. That afternoon, he walked to the Veterans Center. The younger volunteers greeted him with the casual respect people reserve for men who have outlived most of their regrets. He didn't mention what happened. He helped repair a broken bench, told a few stories about rain in foreign deserts, and left before the speeches. By the time he returned home, the answering machine was full. Daniel's voice in various stages of regret. Rebecca's alternating between anger and pleading. We were scared, she said in one message. We just wanted to make sure you were safe. He erased each one after listening once. Some things need to be heard only to confirm they're over. Days passed quietly. He cooked small meals, read the paper, fed the birds. The neighborhood kids waved when they saw him, and he waved back with a hand that still remembered how to salute. Nights were steady, the kind that made him wish Marjorie could see how well the house had aged. One evening, while watering the garden, he noticed Daniel's car parked at the curb again. The door opened slowly. His son stepped out, no coat, no folder, no wife. Just Daniel. Mind if I come in? He asked. Harold nodded. Inside, Daniel sat at the table where everything had ended. The same chair. The same light. I'm sorry, he said. We were stupid. I was stupid. I thought you'd be relieved if I handled things. I didn't see what it looked like to you. Harold waited until the words stopped shaking. What made you see it now? I lost a client last week. I was in control of everything. Turns out I wasn't. He nodded slowly. Control's just fear with good posture. Daniel laughed, a sound half-tear. You always talked in riddles. And you always understood them too late, Harold said. They sat for a long while. The kettle hissed between them. Finally, Daniel whispered, can we start over? You already have, Harold said. The moment you walked in without a plan. When Daniel left that night, the air between them was lighter. A bridge rebuilt quietly in the dark. Weeks folded into months. The trust settled, the shelter's kitchen got new tiles. The scholarship awarded its first recipient. The maple bloomed early, heavy with birds. Sometimes Rebecca sent short messages, updates about work, questions about Daniel. He replied politely but briefly. Some stories don't need sequels. One morning, a neighbor stopped him at the fence. Heard you had a rough patch with your kids, she said. You doing all right? He smiled. Better than ever. You find out who you are when people stop pretending for you. The days began to blur again, but in a different way, softly, peacefully. He started leaving the front door open on warm afternoons. Strangers sometimes came by from the shelter to drop off cookies or thank him for the stove. They never stayed long, but their voices lingered, filling the hallways with the sound of purpose. At night, he would sit on the porch, hands folded, the light above his head steady. Somewhere in the distance, trains still came and went, carrying other people's goodbyes. But his journey had already arrived where it needed to. He thought about the airport, about that last moment when he watched the gate close behind those strangers. He realized it wasn't an ending at all. It was the world giving him one last performance of greed before the curtain rose on peace. The wind picked up, shaking the maple leaves into applause. Inside, the phone rang once. Stories don't need to be repeated to prove they're true. He closed his eyes, letting the silence finish what justice had started. The porch light hummed faintly, haloing the steps in gold. From the street, the house looked ordinary again. One more modest place tucked between others, none of them knowing how close this one had come to being stolen. The wind pushed through the maple branches, scattering small shadows across the siding. He sat still, eyes closed, the sound of leaves like old applause. Somewhere inside, the kettle clicked off by itself and he smiled. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to plan. The days that followed were simple, almost suspiciously calm. He rose at dawn, trimmed the hedges, fixed what didn't need fixing. The world moved around him but didn't intrude. He could walk into town and not hear his name carried behind him in pity or rumor. It was as if the town itself understood what he'd done and had agreed, silently, to give him back his peace. He stopped at the bakery one morning and found Daniel sitting at a corner table, coffee untouched, eyes hollow in that way people's eyes get when they finally run out of pretending. He looked up, startled like a man caught remembering. Dad, he said quietly. Morning, Harold answered, not stopping. But Daniel stood. He didn't know what to say. So he did what he always did when words failed. He nodded once, deeply, as if to promise he'd heard her correctly. The next day, the newspaper ran a small story. Local Veterans Trust revitalizes community kitchen. He didn't clip it. He didn't need to. The house already knew. That evening, Daniel showed up again, this time with Rebecca. Her face was different, less polished, more human. She held an envelope. We sold the condo, she said quietly. We wanted to contribute to the fund. It's not much, but we want to help. He took the envelope and placed it on the table without looking inside. It's not about the amount, he said. It's about the direction. Rebecca nodded, eyes glassy. I'm sorry for what we did. For how we made you feel small. He looked at her, then at Daniel. You didn't make me small. You reminded me how big a man has to be to choose quiet over anger. They stayed for dinner. The conversation was easy, fragile, like glass balancing on fingertips. But it was honest. When they left, she hugged him, the kind of hug people give when they mean it. He didn't return it right away. Then he did. Months turned into a year. The house became what it had always wanted to be, a place of purpose, not just possession. The front porch hosted Saturday meals for volunteers from the shelter. The garden grew twice as wide. Kids from the community college came to help paint the fence, calling him Mr. Whitman, with a respect that made him laugh. One afternoon, he found Daniel kneeling near the maple, repairing the soil line around its roots. He watched quietly from the porch. His son looked up, sweat streaking his forehead. "I come here when I need to think," Daniel said. "That's a good habit." "Rebecca's pregnant," Daniel said after a pause. Harold smiled. "Then teach the child to plant before it can talk." Daniel laughed, but it came out as a sob. "You're going to be a grandfather." "I already am," Harold said. "Just hadn't met them yet." When the baby was born, they named her Marjorie. He held her once, careful, reverent. Her hand wrapped around his finger like a promise no one needed to write down. Seasons rotated. The maple bloomed again. He aged slower somehow, as if contentment had its own gravity. One late afternoon, while he sat on the porch polishing an old toolbox, a car pulled up. A young reporter stepped out, holding a recorder. "Mr. Whitman?" He sighed but smiled. "That's what they keep calling me. I'm writing about the community trust. People say you changed this neighborhood." I just reminded it what kindness sounds like when it isn't asking for applause. "May I quote you?" "You just did." The article came out a week later. Neighbors left pies on his porch. Strangers sent letters. He read a few, answered none. Attention was a visitor he didn't invite often. But sometimes at night, he'd read one aloud to the empty kitchen, just to hear the words echo. In the spring of his 78th year, the shelter threw a celebration marking the trust's anniversary. The new stove, the scholarships, the restored park, all carried his name, though he'd never approved it. They asked him to speak. He stood at the podium, hand steady, voice slow. "This isn't my story," he said. "It's yours. I just made sure the house pointed in the right direction. I built it to hold people, not pride. And now it holds all of you." Applause rolled through the room like weather. That night, when he returned home, the porch light flickered once, then steadied. He sat in his chair beneath it, the same chair he'd chosen when he first realized silence was power, not punishment. The air smelled of earth after rain. The maple shifted, whispering the small language only he could understand. He reached into his coat pocket and found the photo from his wedding day, edges soft from time. He looked at her face, the way her eyes smiled before her lips did, and said, "We did it, Marjorie. We made it last." A few blocks away, Daniel rocked his daughter to sleep, humming an old tune he couldn't quite remember learning. By the next winter, the trust had doubled in size. The house had become a symbol, a story families whispered when they needed reminding that greed ages faster than grace. People began leaving small envelopes on his porch, cash checks, handwritten notes that read, "For the kitchen, for the scholarship, for someone who needs a start." He never told anyone who left them. Some things work better in secret. And so the years. One morning, when the air was all frost and birdsong, Daniel arrived to find the door unlocked and the kettle warm. Harold was in his chair on the porch, eyes closed, a faint smile still there. On his lap lay the wedding photo, and beneath his hand, a note written in clean, steady lines. "If you're reading this, don't be sad. The house knows what to do. Keep the porch light on. Someone always finds their way home." Daniel sat beside him for a long while before calling anyone. The maple above them swayed, scattering a few golden leaves that landed like blessings. The papers called it the Whitman legacy. The town called it gratitude. But to those who knew, it was something quieter, a man's final correction to a world that had forgotten how to spell decency. And on nights when the wind carried through the branches, neighbors swore they could still hear him humming, kettle clicking, the house breathing, alive, awake, forgiving. The light moved slowly across the porch that morning, inching toward the edge of his father's chair. It touched his sleeve first, then his open hand, then the folded note beneath it. Daniel sat beside him, unable to move, unable to disturb the stillness that had settled like a final act done right. He'd never seen peace look so complete. His father's expression wasn't frozen. It was resting, like a man finally released from a long appointment with duty. The maple above them whispered its slow hymn, leaves catching sunlight like stained glass. Daniel reached out, fingers shaking, and touched the paper his father had left. The words were simple. "If you're reading this, don't be sad. The house knows what to do. Keep the porch light on. Someone always finds their way home." He folded it once, slid it into his jacket, and sat back in the other chair. The morning stretched on. Cars passed, a dog barked, and the world behaved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had. The world just hadn't learned it yet. When the officials came, they moved quietly. The paramedic murmured condolences. The coroner took notes. Daniel answered their questions automatically. Yes, natural causes. Yes, he'd been fine yesterday. No, there was nothing unfinished. They carried his father gently down the steps, and Daniel followed until the hearse turned the corner and the taillights disappeared behind the maple's trunk. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't emptiness, it was inheritance. The house seemed to listen to him breathe, waiting for his next decision. Rebecca arrived later that afternoon, her face pale from crying. She stopped at the threshold, unwilling to cross it without permission. "He's really gone," she whispered. "He's home," Daniel said softly. "He never really left." They walked through the rooms together. Every object seemed arranged deliberately, as if each one had been waiting to be discovered. On the kitchen counter sat a small stack of envelopes labeled to be opened in order. The first bore Daniel's name. He opened it carefully. Inside, a single sentence written in his father's tight, deliberate hand. "You'll know what to do if you've truly learned what mattered." No instructions. No demands. Just faith left behind like a mirror. The next envelope was addressed to Rebecca. She opened hers and read silently, then pressed it to her chest. When Daniel asked what it said, she smiled through tears. "It says be kind, even when you've already won." The last envelope was unmarked. Inside were keys, a set Daniel recognized but couldn't place. On the back of the card tied to them another line, "There's a second gate now." Behind the maple, he looked through the kitchen window. The tree swayed gently in the late afternoon light, and behind it, near the fence line, a patch of earth looked freshly turned. He and Rebecca walked out together, crunching across the gravel path. The gate was new but old-fashioned, writing. Beyond it, a narrow path led to a small structure he hadn't noticed before. It was a workshop, newly built, cedar siding gleaming, a brass plaque over the door, the Whitman Repair House. Inside, rows of tools hung neatly on pegboard. The air smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. On the workbench sat a stack of papers, schematics, budgets, volunteer rosters, all signed by his father. The workshop was registered as part of the trust, meant for anyone in town who wanted to learn to fix rather than throw away. Rebecca touched the plaque, tracing the letters. "He built this without saying a word. He built everything without saying a word," Daniel said. That night, Daniel stayed in the house alone. The wind pushed gently through the open windows, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. He slept on the couch, the same couch he'd once avoided sitting on as a teenager. When he woke at dawn, he realized the house didn't feel haunted. It felt busy, like it had already started working on its next project. In the days that followed, people began arriving. The shelter director came first, her eyes red but grateful. "We're holding a small memorial," she said. "We'd like to do it here in the yard." He'd want it that way. Then came the veterans, men and women who'd known Harold not from stories, but from service and silence. They carried folded flags, medals, and memories. The college sent its first scholarship recipient, a young woman with oil-stained hands who spoke about how his donation had changed her life. She said she'd never met him but felt like she had. One evening, Daniel unlocked the attic, a place he hadn't entered since childhood. Dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight. He found boxes labeled in his father's careful handwriting, letters, blueprints, old taxes, and one marked simply her. Inside were dozens of small envelopes addressed to Marjorie, letters written long after she'd gone. Each began the same way. "My dear girl, today was ordinary, and that's how I know I'm still living right." Daniel read every one. By the time he finished, the sun had set, and he understood that love could outlast almost anything, even silence. Months later, the city council voted to rename the street Whitman Lane. Daniel didn't attend the ceremony. He stayed at the workshop, teaching a boy how to repair a cracked wooden chair. The boy asked, "Why fix this old thing when we could just get a new one?" Daniel smiled. "Because it remembers us." That night, after locking up, he sat on the porch the same way his father used to. The house looked different now, painted, alive, but it still carried that same gentle hum. He took out the note again, reading it for the 100th time. "Keep the porch light on. Someone always finds their way home." The bulb above him flickered once as if responding. He replaced it the next day not because it was broken but because some things deserve new light. Years went by. The workshop expanded, the scholarship multiplied, and people who'd never known Harold Whitman still spoke his name like a promise. When Daniel grew old, he often sat under the maple with his granddaughter, Marjorie, telling her about the man who'd taught him the difference between having a house and having a heart. She'd listen wide-eyed, holding a small wooden plane he'd carved for her. "Did he ever get angry?" she asked once. "Never for long," Daniel said. He believed anger's just love that forgot what it was protecting. And when she asked what the porch light was for, he told her, "It's for everyone still learning their way home." Years later, after Daniel was gone too, the house still stood. The trust ensured it would. The porch light never went out. Volunteers replaced it when it dimmed, just as the old man once had. And in that light the town always seemed softer, steadier, kinder. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind moved through the maple, people swore they could hear two voices, one laughing low, the other answering gently like two old friends still keeping watch. And somewhere beyond the sound of leaves and time, a single truth stayed written in the wood, the walls, and the hearts of everyone who ever passed that porch. A house is not what you build. It's what you leave behind that keeps the light on. The first winter after his father's passing came in slow, white layers, softening the world but sharpening memory. Daniel kept the porch shoveled, though no one asked him to. The path to the maple stayed clear, the fence line tidy, the light always on by dusk. He didn't do it out of duty anymore. He did it because routine had turned into reverence. Every morning began with the same quiet. The house hummed to itself, a steady warmth alive inside the walls. He'd brew coffee, pour 2 cups out of habit, set one across from him at the kitchen table, and wait until the steam thinned. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not because he believed in ghosts, but because words sound truer when they have an audience. "We're doing fine," he'd say. "The kids from the college fixed the roof. Rebecca's still stubborn about overwatering the herbs. You like her now, Dad? She's softer." He never heard an answer, but the pipes always knocked once, and he took that as enough. The workshop behind the maple became busier than he'd imagined. People came with things they didn't think could be repaired. Radios, clocks, chairs with one leg longer than the others. They left with stories instead of receipts. A retired machinist named Gus taught teenagers how to sand wood smooth enough to catch sunlight. A woman who'd lost her husband in the service donated old uniforms to be repurposed into aprons for the shelter kitchen. Someone painted a mural on the side of the shed, a pair of hands cradling a tiny flame, beneath it the words, "Keep the porch light on." Halfway through the day, a man Daniel didn't recognize approached him. Gray beard, rough hands, eyes too clear to be ordinary. "You Harold's boy?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "I knew him a long time ago," the man said. He saved my life overseas. Never bragged about it, just did it. Been trying to find a way to thank him ever since." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small medal, worn but polished. "Guess this'll have to do." Daniel took it gently. "He never mentioned you." "He wouldn't," the man said. "Didn't like cluttering up good stories with the truth." After the man left, Daniel pinned the medal to the inside of his jacket. He didn't tell anyone. Some things weren't meant for display, they were meant to anchor you quietly. That summer, the shelter expanded again, adding a dormitory wing with funds from the trust. The plaque at the entrance reads simply, "Built by kindness, sustained by use." When Daniel toured it, the director stopped him near the kitchen door. "We kept the stove he bought running," she said. "Every night someone asks who gave it to us. We tell them, a man who believed in second chances." Rebecca began organizing workshops for widows and veterans, teaching them small repairs, how to rewire lamps, patch floors, hang doors. "Fixing something," she told them, "isn't about the thing. It's about remembering you can." At home, their granddaughter Marjorie started walking. She'd toddle through the garden, chasing butterflies and sometimes settling in the dirt beside Daniel as he weeded. "Papa, what's that?" she'd ask, pointing at the workshop. "That," he'd say, "is where broken things learn they aren't finished." Sometimes she'd help him sweep the porch, insisting on using her tiny broom. Once, after dropping it and watching it roll under the steps, she began to cry. Daniel knelt beside her, whispering the same words his father once told him, "Patience is sharper than steel." She didn't understand yet, but one day she would. By autumn, the festival became tradition. Every year more people came, bringing with them memories that belonged to the house even if they didn't. They hung photos of repairs, recipes, small thank you notes on the fence. One boy brought his college acceptance letter, stapled it near the gate, and wrote, "For Mr. Whitman, because of you I fixed more than my grades." As the years passed, the legend of the house grew, but it never turned grand. It stayed human. The porch light never dimmed. When bulbs burned out, someone always replaced them before nightfall. Children in the neighborhood started calling it the lighthouse, not knowing the irony, only that it made them feel safe when walking home after dark. And then years later, when Daniel's own hair had gone gray, the mayor visited. "We're proposing a new civic center," she said. "We want to name it after your father." Daniel shook his head. He'd hate that. He'd say names belong to gravestones, not buildings. "If you want to honor him, make sure the doors never lock and the lights never go out." She smiled. "We can do that." The center opened 2 years later. Its design mirrored Harold's house: wide porch, big windows, a central kitchen visible from every hallway. The dedication ceremony was small but heartfelt. At its entrance hung a single plaque with 5 words: "Keep the porch light on." Rebecca passed away one gentle spring morning in her sleep. She'd left a note too, tucked beside Daniel's pillow. "He was right about you. You learned how to fix hearts, not just hinges." After her funeral, Daniel spent more time alone in the garden. He tended the soil with the same patience his father once used to tend him. His granddaughter, now 16, joined him often. She'd inherited her great-grandmother's eyes and her great-grandfather's calm. One evening she asked, "Do you ever get tired of all the visitors?" He smiled. "No. They're the proof." "Of what?" "That goodness survives its maker." As night fell, the two of them sat on the porch. The wind rustled through the maple, scattering its seeds like small prayers. The porch light blinked on automatically. Daniel leaned back, staring. Marjorie said, "Do you think he still sees us?" "I think he's the reason the light never burns out," he said. When Daniel passed, years later, the town held another service beneath the maple. His granddaughter spoke. She was grown now, voice strong, presence steady. "My grandfather used to say houses remember the people who speak kindly inside them. This one remembers 3 generations of forgiveness." She looked up at the workshop behind her, its windows glowing. "He taught me how to build, but my great-grandfather taught me why." The crowd listened. Even the wind seemed to pause. Afterward, she walked to the porch alone, touched the railing and whispered, "I'll keep it on." Then she unlocked the door, stepped inside, and began to make tea. Years turned into decades. The Whitman Trust continued to grow, funding more shelters, more workshops, more scholarships. The original house became a heritage landmark, though locals never called it that. To them, it was still just the house with the light. Visitors came from other towns, sometimes other states, to see it. They'd take photos, walk through the rooms, and always stop at the kitchen table where a framed note sat under glass: "Keep the porch light on." Someone always finds their way home. In time, the town evolved around it, new buildings, new families, but that single porch remained untouched. Its boards were replaced when necessary, its paint renewed every few years, but its soul stayed intact. Late one night, long after everyone had gone, a storm swept through the valley. The wind howled, rain hammered, thunder cracked so close it rattled the windows. But the lights stayed on. Power flickered across the grid, went dark in half the town, yet somehow the bulb above the porch glowed steady, a single warm eye against the storm. When dawn came, people emerged to find branches scattered, roofs dented, fences broken. But the house on Whitman Lane stood unchanged, the light still burning, casting gold across the wet street. They took it as a sign, and maybe it was, because a month later, a family moving to town stopped at that porch by mistake. The father knocked, thinking it was their new address. The door opened to a young woman, Marjorie, grown and smiling. "You're a few blocks off," she said. The man apologized, embarrassed, then paused. "That light," he said. "It's beautiful. Reminds me of my grandmother's house." Marjorie nodded. "That's what it's for." He thanked her and left. But something about the moment stayed with him. Later, when his own daughter asked why he'd been quiet all evening, he said, "I think I just saw what home looks like." And so the story spread again. People talked. People remembered. People tried, in their own quiet ways, to keep their own lights burning a little longer at night. Because sometimes one man's simple decency can survive long enough to teach a whole town what it means to care. And on certain evenings when the wind comes soft and the maple rustles just right, if you stand at the gate behind the tree, you might hear something faint. A kettle click, a laugh, the low hum of a man who never stopped keeping watch. The light still burns. And it always will. The first rumor came folded inside a neighbor's hello. A new company had begun calling down the street, asking about interest and options, lingering on the word revitalization like a salesman testing perfume. By the second week, glossy mailers appeared, renderings of glassy townhomes and cafes that looked more like photo shoots than places where anyone would spill soup and apologize. The map at the back showed Whitman Lane as a corridor, which is a way a plan calls a neighborhood by a name that forgets children live there. Marjorie read the brochure on the porch with her feet up on the rail and the porch light off, because daylight could carry the weight for now. She was 22, the kind of age that turns memory into purpose if it's taught well. She folded the paper once, then again, then tighter, until it fit inside her palm like a problem you could hold. The house felt her decide. The maple shifted once, twice like approval. She didn't call anyone yet. She walked to the workshop and opened every window. The smell of sawdust and oil rolled out like an argument that remembered its manners. On the pegboard, the sizes hung in a logic her great-grandfather could have read with his eyes closed. She took down the square and the chalk line. If they wanted to measure her street, she would measure first. The calls sharpened. Men with nice voices said they loved small towns. Women with nicer voices said they loved history. Everyone said the word opportunity and nobody said the word eviction. People on Whitman Lane began comparing notes at dusk the way neighbors compare lightning. How close, how loud, how often. Marjorie listened and said little. It had taken 3 generations to teach her that noise and urgency are cousins who never learned to knock. On a gray Thursday, a car with tinted windows stopped at the curb. A man stepped out in a suit that looked like it would wrinkle only if memory pulled at it. He walked up the path as if the path had introduced itself. He admired the maple, praised the paint, admired again. "We've heard so much about this place," he said, smiling with all his teeth. "You must be Ms. Whitman." "I must be," she said. He introduced himself as from the firm, and the word from seemed to claim distance as a virtue. He talked about synergy, property refreshment, public-private partnerships. He had the gift of turning verbs into sedatives. He promised a plaque, a story wall, an exhibit in the lobby that would honor the legacy. The house, he said, could be reimagined as a lounge for residents. He emphasized that this would bring jobs, then added that people like her would have a place in the plan. He did not specify what kind of place. She let him finish because interrupting a pitch teaches it to grow longer legs. When he finally asked what she thought, she said, "We fixed our stove so we could feed people. Our stove so we could feed people. We didn't fix our values so we could sell them." She watched him decide whether to be offended or amused. He chose professional. "There are financial realities," he said gently, as if speaking to a chair that might feel. "Maintenance, insurance, aging infrastructure. You could do a lot of good with the money." She looked past him to the porch light. Daylight had begun to thin. "We already are." He adjusted his cuff. "Think about it. We'll make an offer that respects the narrative." It sounded like a threat written on thick paper. After he left, Marjorie took the folder from the drawer under the radio. The trust papers felt older than she was and wiser. She read the covenant again, the clause in plain language that her great-grandfather and Sandra Kell had insisted on like a seatbelt. The maple protected, the house purposed, the porch light no one's to dim. A phrase near the bottom had always made her proud, used before show. She set the papers down and exhaled. There are days when a legacy feels like a story. There are days when it feels like a tool. The next morning, a drone buzzed over the lane. It hovered long enough to feel like disrespect, and then sketched away toward the river. By afternoon, a survey crew appeared with tripods and yellow vests and the particular politeness of people following orders. Neighbors watched from porches, arms crossed. Nobody yelled. Nothing ruins a case like volume. When the crew reached the maple, they stopped. The plaque at its base, small and unamused, said what needed saying, "Protected." One of the crew touched his cap and moved the tripod back 3 feet without waiting to be asked. That night, the town hall was full. Not the sort of full that brings chanting, The sort that hums with citizens who have babysitters they promise to relieve before 10. The agenda read briskly. Then item 5 arrived with a cough. Rezoning. Corridor plan. A woman from the firm spoke first, slides by her practicing persuasion with color. She said transit. She said vibrancy. She said the word anchor and gestured gracefully toward the screen showing a drawing of a porch that looked like a porch that had never known winter. When public comment opened, silence sat first to introduce itself. Then a man in a baseball cap walked up and said he grew up 3 doors down and learned to apologize on that sidewalk. A younger woman said the house fed her when the world didn't. A teenager explained what it felt like to build a birdhouse and have a stranger call it beautiful. No one raised their voice. The room made space for sentences to finish. Marjorie stepped up last. She did not bring slides. She brought the folder. This street is a promise, she said. Not a line on a map. We are not against change. We are against forgetting. She placed copies of the covenant on the table for the council. The house is a trust. Its use is defined, its protection recorded. Zoning that ignores purpose is a paper exercise. We don't do paper exercises here. We do work. The firm's lawyer smiled in the way the paper smiles. Trusts are flexible, he offered, sashaying into precedent from another county, another street. That one wasn't, said a voice from the back. Heads turned as Sandra Kell stood, older, smaller, eyes brighter. Some ink doesn't wash. The council recessed. In the hallway, people pretended to find water. The firm pretended not to count votes. Outside, the maple did what trees do in civic crises. It stood there. Weeks became a calendar with fewer spaces between its days. The firm shifted from charm to pressure. A rumor suggested grants would evaporate if the corridor plan failed. Another rumor argued that failing to build would attract worse builders. Rumor is a carpenter who works fast and never measures. The neighborhood kept measuring anyway. Marjorie started a ledger on the kitchen table, the way Harold once started mornings. Who needed what was repaired, who could teach on Saturdays, who could watch children while meetings stole hours from decent lives. Laughter returned, this time different, less celebration, more camaraderie. Someone brought stew. Someone fixed a railing. Someone tuned a piano no one knew would play again. Resistance that cooks dinner stays standing longer. In the second month, a letter arrived addressed not to her but to occupant. The envelope was heavy with the kind of weight that believes itself respectable. Inside, the firm respectfully requested access to conduct non-invasive assessments. They offered a stipend for inconvenience. They signed it with the elegant illegibility executives love. She placed it under the magnet shaped like a tomato on the fridge and pinned a note over it, used before the show. The first escalation came quiet. An inspector appeared unannounced, escorted by an official who apologized first. Routine, he said. We're looking at old wiring across the block. He glanced up at the porch light like a man looking for a reason to be forgiven. They walked the perimeter. Inside, they admired outlets with unexpected interest. When they left, the official touched the railing. I ate soup here once, he said, half to himself. The next escalation arrived noisy. A truck rumbled down the lane at dawn and paused outside the workshop. 2 men unloaded plywood and leaned it like a threat. They looked left and right as if expecting applause. That was their mistake. Applause is loud when it's earned and silent when it's not. They began to nail a notice to the fence. The first nail squealed. The second nail bent. The third nail fell out of a hand suddenly cautious with its grip. How long you plan to stand there? Asked Gus, materializing with a hammer that had inherited his patience. Until this goes up, one of the men said, trying on authority that didn't fit. Then you'll be standing a while. You've got the wrong fence, said Marjorie, stepping beside him, covenant in hand. And the wrong town. They removed the plywood and climbed back into the truck with the awkward grace of men who know they will be in a story and do not like their roles. The hearing dragged. The firm bought ads that did not know how to blush. They commissioned a study that counted foot traffic like beans. They hired a spokesperson who wore sincerity like a blazer. The town kept showing up. Old men explained the physics of kindness. Young mothers explained the logistics of trust. Teenagers explained that not every future needs glass. On the 4th night of testimony, the lights flickered in the chamber. People laughed, uneasy. The room exhaled when the power returned. Even the grid knows we're bored, someone whispered. But the flicker did what flickers do, it summarized. Everyone had seen the light blink and the room survive. Everyone remembered a porch that had refused to go dark when the storm thought it could convince it. In the end, the vote was close. Close is how truth wins in public. If it had been easy, it wouldn't teach anyone anything. The corridor plan passed for 2 blocks toward the river and failed on Whitman Lane. The firm issued a statement about listening. The town issued no statement at all. It held a potluck and put out more chairs. That night, Marjorie stood on the porch long after the last Tupperware left with its rightful owner. The light threw its usual circle on the boards. She thought of the long chain of small decisions that had led to this one. Harold's Thursday knives and quiet, Daniel's change of posture at a kitchen table, Rebecca's envelope and the way she had learned to water less, the way a clause written in plain words had turned a plan into a promise. She spoke aloud, and if anyone had passed, they might have thought she was talking to the air. "We won't sell what we feed with," she said. The house listened without moving. The next morning, kids arrived early to paint new birdhouses. They spread newspaper on the steps and smeared the porch with color that would wash. A boy with careful hands asked if he could paint the light itself. "You can paint the shade," she told him. "The light does its own work." Summer made the street generous. On Fridays, a guitar showed up at the edge of the yard and grew into music. A woman recited a poem about screws and patience. Someone set a chessboard on the railing and lost on purpose to a child who needed to practice triumph without apology. On Sundays, the workshop emptied while the kitchen filled. People didn't ask for recipes. They asked for seconds, which is the only honest compliment food understands. The firm came back twice, quieter each time, as if approaching a wild animal that had already studied them longer than they could study it. The last representative was younger, eyes quick, questions better. "What would you accept?" she asked frankly, sitting on the steps with a notebook she wasn't pretending to hide. "If not purchase, then what?" "Help without property lines," Marjorie said. "Fund the tool program. Back the stove repairs. Pay for bulbs. Leave your logo off the door. That's the price." The representative wrote, nodded, looked up at the light and said almost to herself, "We don't know how to do that." "Learn," said Marjorie. They surprised her. In September, a check arrived made out to the trust for an amount that could fix a great many stoves. No plaque followed. A short letter did. "For use, not show." Someone in a glass building had understood a sentence that was older than their lease. Years unraveled into a clarity that felt like a good sweater. The street didn't stay the same. It learned how to change without forgetting. Houses were painted new colors that time wouldn't hate. Fences were mended by people who didn't wait to be asked. The city replaced the water main without tearing up the maple's roots because the crew lead had a grandson who had once eaten soup here on a night. His father lost his job and found his temper. Every so often, a lost tourist would wander down Whitman Lane and pause at the fence, squinting at the small plaque as if squinting could read values. They would knock, ask for the story, and leave with something they thought was a summary: kindness, legacy, community. The house did not correct them. Summaries are for people who have planes to catch. On a winter evening so cold it scraped, Marjorie found herself alone at the kitchen table with the ledger open. The pages were crowded with names and numbers, and the occasional doodle from a child who had borrowed a pen without permission. She ran her finger down a column and laughed at the arithmetic of generosity. It never balances and somehow pays. The porch light clicked on with the soft authority of habit. She did not look up. She had always trusted it to do its job. The phone rang then. A number she did not know. She answered because the house had trained her to be reachable. A voice introduced himself as the man with the medal from the festival years ago, voice older, breath thinner. "I'm in town," he said. "I keep thinking about your grandfather. Do you still make soup?" "Every Thursday," she said. "I'll be there Tuesday," he answered. And she understood that men who have fought do not negotiate calendars the way bureaucrats do. He arrived with the weather on his coat and the past in his shoes. They sat by the window. He told a story about a desert and a night and a decision not to fire, and how Harold's hand had lowered a rifle with the calm authority of someone who knew the price of learning quickly. "He saved 2 lives, the man said. "One of them was mine. The other one was the one I didn't take. I've been trying to pursue that interest ever since." They ate quietly. When he left, he touched the porch light with 2 fingers, a salute that didn't need an audience. In spring, a girl who had failed algebra twice fixed the timing on a washing machine with her bare hands and a manual she had insisted on reading. She danced in the workshop when it spun true and wrote "I am not a mistake" on the inside of the lid before closing it. No one told her not to. In summer, a storm brought down a power line at the end of the block. The neighborhood went dark except for candles in this porch. People gathered by the light without making a plan. Someone began to tell a story that took too long, but nobody minded answering with another. The baby across the way stopped crying because laughter nearby sounds like safety to ears that don't yet understand grammar. When the power came back, no one cheered. They kept talking for another hour as if the old way had offered nothing they wanted. Autumn invited a decision. The city offered to place the house on a register that came with protections and obligations in equal measure. It would make change slower, which is to say more thoughtful. It would attract more visitors, which is to say more interruptions. It would codify what everyone already knew, which is to say it might turn into show if not watched carefully. Marjorie stood in the yard with the form and asked the maple to vote. The wind said nothing. That felt like permission. She signed, adding a line in blue ink at the bottom where there was no line to add, use before the show. The clerk didn't know what to do with it. He filed it anyway. On the day the certificate arrived, she placed it not on a wall but under the glass on the kitchen table, where spilled tea and elbows and homework would teach it humility. That night, a little girl traced the seal with a finger sticky from jam and asked if the picture was a coin. "It's a promise," said her mother. "Same thing if you spend it right." Time did what time does with houses that refused to die and people who refused to leave. It began to tell their story for them. The firm built further down the river. Their buildings filled, then learned the loneliness of units that never see the same faces twice. Some nights, a handful of their residents walked up to Whitman Lane to stand under the light without saying why. They went home slower. That was enough. Every December, on the night Harold first taped a note inside a cabinet and called it a plan, the lane threw a small celebration. No stage. No microphone. Someone read aloud from a scrap of paper rescued from a drawer years ago. "Make soup for strangers here." They made too much on purpose. The leftovers always found mouths. The words never found the end of their meaning. One year, in the middle of the gathering, an old woman squeezed Marjorie's hand and said, "I didn't raise my son well enough to bring him here when he needed this. He's gone now. But I wanted you to know I'm still cooking from what you taught me." She laughed at herself, embarrassed by the confession, but the porch light made even embarrassment look useful. When the city eventually replaced the street signs with ones that matched the new decorative standard, someone stole the old Whitman Lane sign and left it on the porch with a note, "We thought you'd want the one with fingerprints." On the night she turned 30, after the last thank you had been waved down the walkway and the last lid clicked on a leftover container, Marjorie sat alone on the steps and imagined the street in 50 years. The light would be on. People would argue about paint colors and recipes and when to plant. A boy would be late to dinner and a girl would teach herself to fix a bicycle, and an old man would knock because he had lost his keys and found his pride. Someone would arrive from far away because a brochure had lied to them, and someone else would hand them a bowl and tell them which lies could be composted into joy. She closed her eyes and saw her great-grandfather at gate B12, coat folded, phone quiet, waiting for the right silence to begin. She saw her grandfather practicing forgiveness without ceremony. She saw a woman who once measured rooms with her eyes now measuring beans and inviting nurses from the night shift to take seconds before thirds. She saw a town learning the value of a sentence written so clearly even a plan could not misunderstand it. The porch light hummed, and in its small constant song she heard the whole story again. Revised for this evening, still true. A house can be stolen by paper but rescued by use. A deed can be signed twice but belong only to the one that includes a kitchen. And legacy is just another word for a light that doesn't ask who you are before it decides to help you see. The wind moved, the maple answered, and night arranged itself around the circle of gold on the boards. She stood, turned the key in the old lock with the confidence of a woman who knew what doors are for, and went inside to set the kettle on for tomorrow. Morning drifted in over Whitman Lane like breath over glass. Frost along the fence melted into threads of light. The porch light clicked itself off, unhurried, as if it trusted the sun to handle things for a while. Inside, the kettle finished its hum. The house smelled of coffee and fresh paint. Every wall had been touched by a volunteer's brush at least once that month. Marjorie moved slowly now, not with age but with certainty. 30 years of mornings had trained her to make quiet do the heavy lifting. The house, the workshop, the trust, they all ran without her instructions. That was the point. She just listened for problems that didn't yet have words. She poured 2 mugs. One she left on the table across from her, out of habit, for whoever memory sent to breakfast. Sometimes a neighbor. Sometimes no one. Habit, she decided, was another kind of prayer. Out back, the maple had grown wide enough to shade both the workshop and half the yard. A bench circled its trunk, carved with initials that belonged to generations who had sat there and thought themselves the first. At its roots, small plaques told smaller stories. A scholarship name, a repaired heart valve, a rebuilt chair. By mid-morning, the lane stirred. Cars rolled by with the confident quiet of electric motors. Children on scooters veered around puddles. From the workshop came the rhythmic tap of wood against steel. A new instructor had taken over there. A woman named Leanne, barely 30, who wore her hair tied with a strip of old flannel she said came from the first apron sewn at the shelter. She was teaching a class on mending, not building, stitching, patching, tightening what already existed. She'd renamed the course Patience 101. When Marjorie looked in, 10 students were bent over their projects. One boy was turning a cracked chair wrung in his hands, eyes narrowed with concentration. "Don't fight it," Leanne said. "Listen. It already knows what shape it wants back." Marjorie smiled and left them to their work. Outside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Down the street, the Civic Center had opened its new wing, a library and community kitchen under one roof. On its door, painted in the same script as the porch plaque, were 5 words that still refused to age: "Keep the porch light on." She crossed the street to deliver a basket of muffins for the morning meeting. Inside, a group of teenagers were debating a project proposal. Their teacher, a thin, restless man with the manner of someone allergic to silence, spotted her and brightened. "Ms. Whitman," he said, "we're discussing civic responsibility. You're basically the syllabus." She laughed. "Then you might need a new one." The youngest student, a girl with turquoise braids, raised her hand. "Did your family really stop the developers from taking over the lane?" Marjorie nodded. "A long fight. A lot of neighbors. No villains, just people who forgot what home means." "And you never sold?" "Not even when they offered a lot. We already had enough." She gestured toward the kitchen beyond the glass, where volunteers were sorting donated produce. "When you can feed people, money looks smaller." The students scribbled notes as if morality came with extra credit. One boy asked, "How do you know when to say no?" She thought for a moment. "When saying yes would make you forget who helped you get here." After lunch, she walked back up the lane, past houses painted in cheerful defiance. A dog barked lazily from a porch. The smell of bread leaked through an open window. These were the quiet victories, ordinary sounds in a place that might have become unrecognizable. At home, letters waited on the table. One bore an unfamiliar seal, an invitation to speak at a conference in the city. Sustainable communities and ethical development. The irony made her smile. She almost threw it away, then saw a handwritten note at the bottom. "My grandmother learned carpentry in your workshop. Please come." She went. The hall downtown was made of glass and confidence. Microphones sprouted from every table. When it was her turn, she walked to the podium with the unhurried gait of someone who still used hammers more than hashtags. "I'm not an expert," she began. "I'm just from a street that refused to forget itself." She told them about Harold's house, about Daniel and Rebecca, about the clause that said use before show. She didn't use slides. She used sentences that sounded like sawdust and bread. She ended simply, "If you build for pride, it cracks. If you build for use, it lasts." When she finished, the applause felt real, but what mattered were the people who waited afterward just to say thank you quietly without cameras. A city planner from Detroit. A teacher from New Mexico. A man from a housing trust who said, "I think we can do that. We just needed to know someone already did." Back home, the porch light was waiting. She turned it on even though the sun hadn't set yet. Days grew shorter. Fall came dressed in gold. The trust celebrated its 50th year with a small gathering. No speeches, just everyone bringing one repaired thing to show. A woman arrived with a mended quilt stitched from old uniforms. A boy brought a bicycle that no longer squeaked. A mechanic rolled in a toolbox polished to a mirror. "Fixed the latch," he said, proud. Marjorie stood near the railing watching the mix of faces, skin tones, languages, ages. A patchwork strong enough to weather anything. When the mayor handed her a certificate, she laughed and passed it to the children to use as a placemat. Paper, she thought, should always earn its keep. That night, after the last car left, she stayed outside. The maple's leaves spun down in a slow dance of orange and rust. She whispered into the dark, "You were right, Grandad. We're still feeding strangers." The wind answered with the faintest creak of branches, which she took as applause. A week later, a filmmaker knocked. He was young, polite, nervous. "I'm making a documentary," he said, "about places that stay good." He asked to record her voice reading the original note, "Keep the porch light on." She agreed on one condition: "Promise me you'll show the kitchen more than the porch." He promised. The film went out months later. People wept in cinemas. Donations doubled. Tourists came. But somehow, the lane absorbed the attention without losing itself. They still made soup every Thursday, still swept the porch before night, still laughed at the idea of fame. Years later, long after Marjorie had passed the stewardship to Lien and the next wave of caretakers, her recording played once more at the annual winter gathering. The children recited the note with her voice, line by line. Outside, snow fell lightly, and the light glowed through it like a patient star. And in the brief silence that followed before anyone clapped, a gust of wind swept through the maple's branches and filled the pause with sound, soft, wooden, certain. The house had learned how to speak for itself. Winter came early that year. Rolling down from the hills like a soft argument, the world didn't know how to end. By the first week of December, frost had settled on every roof in town. Smoke rose straight from chimneys before bowing to the wind. Whitman Lane looked the way good memory should, not perfect but honest. Inside the workshop, the smell of cedar and glue thickened the air. Lien moved between the tables, adjusting clamps, checking joints, guiding hands. The students had grown older now. Some brought their children to learn. The benches were scarred from use, small maps of perseverance. The sound of sanding echoed like distant rain. Marjorie watched from the doorway, bundled in her scarf. Her breath made ghosts in the air. "You've turned this place into a heartbeat," she said. Lien smiled without looking up. "It's easy. The walls remember how." At noon they took their lunch outside, soup, bread, tea that steamed like good gossip. Neighbors wandered over, carrying tools, notes, or just appetite. A boy read aloud from an old article about the house, shaking his head in disbelief. "It says people travel here from other countries just to see the porch light." "They do," Marjorie said. "And then they sit for 5 minutes and realize it's just a bulb in a socket. That's when they get it." "What do they get?" the boy asked. "That the bulb isn't the miracle. It's the reason it's still on." He thought about that, nodded slowly, and went back to his soup. Later, as the sky dimmed, a truck stopped at the curb. Out stepped a woman wrapped in a red coat, clutching a camera. "I'm looking for Ms. Whitman," she said. "That's me," Marjorie replied. "I'm from Chicago," the woman said. "My grandmother used to write you letters. Said this house saved her life." Marjorie gestured to the steps. "You'd better come in before the soup gets cold." They sat by the fire as snow began to fall. The woman explained. Her grandmother had been one of the first scholarship recipients. She'd gone on to start her own small repair co-op in Illinois. "She kept a photo of this porch on her fridge for 40 years, she said. "When she died, I found it. I just wanted to see it once." Marjorie felt tears threaten but blinked them back. "She probably kept that light burning too." "Did," the woman said. "Even in summer." They talked for hours. When she left, Marjorie handed her a small jar of the garden's honey and a single bulb from the pantry. "In case you need a reminder," she said. The woman laughed softly. "My neighbors will think I'm sentimental." "They'll be right," Marjorie said. As the months rolled forward, more visitors came, not tourists now but apprentices, planners, people wanting to learn how to build something that lasted. Lien created a manual she called the Light Handbook, detailing not architecture, but philosophy, how to create spaces that teach responsibility through care. She mailed it to city councils across the state, handwritten notes on the cover, use before show. And slowly the idea spread. In nearby towns, new workshops appeared. One in a disused school gym, another in a church basement. Each kept a single lamp burning in the window. Each adopted the rule: repairs free, lessons cheaper, respect mandatory. People began referring to these places collectively as lights. It wasn't branding. It was belief. When the first light outside the county opened, Marjorie attended quietly, sitting in the back while a young woman explained how they'd built their benches from salvaged wood. "We used what we had," she said. "It's not fancy, but it works." Marjorie caught her eye afterward and smiled. Fancy never fed anyone. The movement gathered quiet momentum. Newspapers caught on, calling it the porch light model. Academics debated its scalability. Activists praised its humility. But none of them could explain why it worked so well. The answer was always too simple for reports. It worked because it was human. At the 50th anniversary of the original trust, the town organized an exhibit in the Civic Center's atrium. Photographs of the Whitman family lined the walls: Harold, Daniel, Rebecca, and a much younger Marjorie holding a hammer almost too big for her hand. In the center of under glass sat the original note found taped under the kitchen cabinet decades ago: "If you're reading this because I'm gone, make soup for strangers here." People cried in that gentle, embarrassed way adults do when reminded that decency has a shape. Later that night, when the hall was empty, Marjorie stayed behind to turn off the lights. She lingered at the cabinet note, her reflection superimposed over the paper. "Still cooking, old man," she whispered. On her way out, she noticed someone had left a folded scrap of paper on the display table. She opened it. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Soup served weekly in Milwaukee now. Stove second hand. Spirits original." She smiled and slipped the note into her pocket. That spring she traveled again, small towns this time. No conferences, no applause, just visits. She found a group of retired miners who'd turned an abandoned break room into a repair cafe. She met a teacher who used Whitman's model to keep at-risk teens out of trouble. She spent one long afternoon helping an elderly woman patch a quilt, while the woman hummed and told stories about her late husband. Everywhere she went, someone recognized the phrase, "keep the porch light on." Sometimes it was printed on a wall, sometimes whispered as a greeting. Once on a train platform in Ohio, she heard two strangers use it like a blessing. "Safe travels," one said. "Keep the porch light on," the other replied. She turned away so they wouldn't see her crying. Back home, Leanne met her at the door. "They're asking for you again," she said. "Another documentary. Bigger one. They want the rights to the story." Marjorie shook her head. "Stories don't have rights. They have responsibilities. So we say no? We say they can film the kitchen," she said. "And if they ask about the light, tell them it's working just fine." Weeks passed. The crew came, shot footage, ate soup, and left humbled. The documentary aired the next winter. It didn't win awards. Didn't need to. People saw it and began writing letters again. Handwritten, stamped, sincere. And one letter changed everything. It came from a prison in upstate New York. The sender wrote that he'd seen the film and wanted to start a workshop behind bars. "I'm not proud of who I was," he wrote, "but I want to learn how to fix what I can reach." Marjorie wrote back the next day. "Start with what's broken and see who joins you." Months later, a photo arrived. 5 inmates around a table repairing a chair. In the corner, a single lamp burned. When she showed the picture to Leanne, they both fell silent for a long time. Then Leanne whispered, "He understood." "Of course he did," Marjorie said. "The broken always do." The house grew older but never tired. The light bulbs were changed so often that the hardware store kept a box labeled Whitman size. When children came by on Halloween, their candy came with small tags printed with Harold's words: "Remember to be the person you promised when your tie was too tight." Parents kept the tags. Children pocketed them without reading, but one day they would. By the time summer rolled around again, the Whitman Light Network stretched across 3 states. No head office, no CEO, just volunteers keeping rooms bright enough for work and talk. And at the center of it all, still always one house, one porch, one unwavering beam through the dark. The years unfolded like careful handwriting. Each one added a line to the letter Harold had started and never finished. The town grew, the lane softened, and the air carried more stories than it had chimneys. Whitman Lane no longer appeared on tourist maps, And that was just how everyone liked it. You had to find it, like decency, like belonging, like truth. Marjorie moved slower now, but her eyes still carried the brightness of people who had seen the long game of goodness and decided it was worth playing. Her hair silvered into the same tone as the maple bark. She didn't like to call it age, she called it polish. The porch light clicked on automatically one evening, but she was already sitting outside, waiting for it. In her lap a book of letters, hundreds of them, from every place the light had reached. Schools, shelters, prisons, farms, churches, even a diner in Texas that kept a glowing bulb above its counter and a sign that read, "Someone cared enough to fix this stool, so you care enough to sit." She ran her fingers across the envelopes like prayer beads. Some letters came from children learning to repair. Others from people learning to forgive. Every one carried the same tone, gratitude written in the ink of humility. Lien joined her, 2 cups of tea in hand. The younger woman had taken over most of the work now, handling the workshops, the visitors, the endless requests. Yet she still came to sit at dusk, like an apprentice honoring ritual. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" Lien asked. Marjorie smiled. "I don't think any of them did. Not Harold, not Daniel, not Rebecca. They just kept doing small things well until the world noticed." "The world notices less these days," Lien said. "It notices the right things slower," Marjorie corrected. "But when it does, it doesn't forget." They sipped in silence. The maple leaned and whispered. A moth circled the light, confused but persistent. From across the street came the laughter of children playing flashlight tag. They darted through the dark like streaks of borrowed stars. One boy stopped in front of the porch, panting, looking up. "It's bright," he said, shielding his eyes. "It's home," Marjorie replied. He grinned and ran off again. Later that night, after Lien had gone home, Marjorie stayed on the porch. She opened one of the letters, the one from a woman in Nairobi who'd turned a small storage room into a light. The letter spoke of community, of a borrowed kettle, of laughter finding its echo again. At the bottom a line read, "We don't have porches here. We keep the light by the door. It works the same." She pressed the paper to her chest and exhaled. "You'd love this, Granddad," she murmured. "You'd finally believe me when I said people listen." Inside, the clock ticked, each sound a footstep walking backward through time. A week later, an old friend from the city visited, the mayor, now gray-haired herself. They sat in the kitchen surrounded by the smell of soup. "You know," the mayor said, "the foundation wants to name an award after you. For civic courage." Marjorie laughed. "Courage is for heroes. I just kept the lights on." "You've kept a lot more than that," the mayor said softly. Marjorie stirred her tea. "If you name it after me, make it about patience, not bravery. Bravery burns fast. Patience burns slow." The mayor nodded, taking notes on a napkin. That's how the Whitman Patience Award was born, given quietly each year to someone who fixed what others ignored. By autumn, her health began to slip. Nothing dramatic, just the slow reminder that even good hearts have clocks. She refused hospitals. The town doctor came to her porch for checkups, always leaving with soup. "You're the healthiest dying woman I've ever seen," he once joked. "I've been practicing," she said. When the snow came again, she stayed mostly indoors, wrapped in a blanket older than Lien's workshop. She read aloud to herself, letters and notes and recipes, so the house would remember the sound of her voice. Every now and then she'd pause and whisper, "Still here," like a roll call. One night Lien came rushing in. "You've got to see this," she said, holding up her phone. It showed a live feed, hundreds of small lights flickering across a map of the world. The network lit candles at midnight in every workshop. "For you," Marjorie smiled, her eyes glistening. "For us," she said. "They're calling it the Global Porch Night." Marjorie, the world finally ran out of excuses not to care. She sat back, letting the glow from the screen reflect in her eyes. Her father's patience, her grandfather's pride, her great-grandfather's quiet fire, all living there at once. The following morning, the town awoke to find the lane blanketed in soft snow. No footprints yet, just untouched white. But one thing broke the perfection, a steady cone of gold spilling from the porch, melting the snow nearest its base. Inside the house, the kettle was on, steam curling upward in a kind of benediction. When Lien arrived with breakfast, she found Marjorie in her chair, blanket drawn up to her chin, eyes closed, hands folded gently. On the table beside her sat one last letter, addressed simply, "To whoever keeps this next." Lien opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was thin but steady. "You don't need to be a Whitman to keep a light burning. You just need to remember who it's for. Use before show always. The rest takes care of itself." At the bottom, a single postscript. "The kettle's full. Invite someone in." The funeral drew people from places even Marjorie hadn't known existed. From every state, every city where a light had been lit. They carried bulbs instead of flowers. When the service ended, they screwed them into sockets lining the lane, one by one, until the street glowed like a river of promise. The mayor stepped forward, tears on her face. "We'll never let it go dark," she said. Lien took her place on the porch. She switched the light on once more and turned to the crowd. "It's not just ours anymore," she said. "It's everyone's now." The people nodded. Some clapped. Some prayed. Some simply looked up, quiet, letting the light settle into their eyes. That night, Whitman Lane could be seen from the highway, a warm line through the dark, a map not drawn but lived. And somewhere above, in that vast quiet the old man used to love, the stars blinked once in approval. Because stories like his don't end. They multiply. And long after names fade from walls and houses change hands, there will always be someone, somewhere, turning a switch, watching that first bloom of light, and whispering the words that started it all. "Keep the porch light on." Years turned like pages in a book the town refused to close. Whitman Lane was still there, though fewer people called it that anymore. Some said the lane, others the porch, others simply home. The plaques had weathered, the paint had faded, but the light still glowed as if it never learned how to stop. Lien was the new keeper. She didn't call herself that. She said she was just passing through, but everyone knew the house trusted her. It leaned with her, breathed with her. The pipes seemed to hum in her rhythm now, and the boards creaked to the same slow tempo of her steps. Outside, the world was noisier. Phones glowed brighter than fireflies. Headlines turned kindness into novelty. People scrolled past stories of generosity as though they were pleasant accidents. But down here, the light didn't scroll. It stayed. Every Thursday, the kettle sang again. Every Friday, the workshop filled. The house had learned to live beyond its owners. An organism built of memory, sweat, laughter, and bread. One morning, Lien walked to the Civic Center, where a new generation of volunteers was organizing what they called Light Week. Students from 10 towns would come to learn how to repair, plant, cook, and listen. It was meant to honor the 75th anniversary of the first trust, 75 years since Harold Whitman had decided that decency was worth writing into law. The city had grown up around them now, tall buildings beyond the hills, new roads, new faces. But every person who came down the lane felt something different in the air. The noise dropped away. The world softened. The first day of Light Week began with rain, not a drizzle but real cleansing rain, the kind that makes the ground remember its shape. The children were restless, cooped up in the workshop, watching water stream down the windows. "We can't do the planting," one boy said. Lien smiled. "Then we'll learn patience. The rain's just teaching us timing." She brought out jars of old nails, bent and rusted, collected over decades of repairs. "Today we fix what's been waiting longest." They spent hours straightening them, humming to themselves. It was dull work but somehow beautiful. When the clouds finally cleared, the sun fell across the tables, gleaming on the nails now straightened into quiet order. The kids clapped. Lien just nodded. "Looks small," she said. "But that's how every big thing starts." Outside, the puddles reflected the maple's leaves. The air smelled of rust and hope. As the week went on, more visitors came. People from cities that had forgotten the texture of slowness. They brought cameras, notebooks, and expressions that looked like hunger disguised as curiosity. Lien welcomed them, but she didn't let them turn the house into a headline. When one journalist asked if she was the heir to the Whitman legacy, she smiled. "No one inherits kindness," she said. "You just borrow it for a while." On the third day, something unexpected happened. A man arrived alone, carrying a box wrapped in cloth. He was middle-aged, face lined by miles of regret. He asked quietly if this was still the Whitman place. "Yes," Lien said. He hesitated, then unwrapped the box. Inside was a wooden stool, plain, scratched, one leg replaced by a mismatched piece of lighter wood. "My father built this when he was in prison," he said. Said it was his way of repaying a light he'd never seen. I thought it should come home. Lien traced the edge of the stool, her throat tight. It already is, she said. The man smiled faintly. I'm not proud of who I was. But he died proud of fixing something. She touched his knee. Then he understood it better than most. That evening, the stool sat beside the porch chair. A quiet symbol beside another quiet symbol. Nothing ornate. Just wood and meaning. The festival continued. Kids ran between the garden beds. The smell of bread drifted through the lane. At sunset, someone strung lanterns along the fence. Each one contained a small slip of paper with a name or a wish. When the wind blew, the lights swayed, and the wishes whispered against each other. A man with a violin began to play softly. He wasn't part of the schedule, he just felt like it. The music threaded through the crowd like warmth through cloth. And then, almost naturally, people began to hum the same tune, until the whole street vibrated with sound. Lien stood at the porch watching. For a moment, she saw the silhouettes of every soul who had stood there before. Harold with his steady hands, Daniel with his mended heart, Rebecca holding her apology, Marjorie with her quiet fire. And behind them others, the nameless, the fed, the forgiven. She whispered, "Still working, old souls?" The wind nodded through the maple's branches. By nightfall, the lane looked like something out of a storybook, golden light spilling across wet pavement, faces upturned, laughter carrying into the dark. Lien turned off her phone and stood barefoot on the porch, feeling the wood cool beneath her feet. She closed her eyes and let the noise of the world fade to the rhythm of the house, kettle, laughter, wind, heartbeat. When she opened them again, the light above her flickered once, twice, then steadied. She smiled. "All right," she whispered. "I see you." The next morning, the headline on the local paper read, "One light, 1,000 homes." But the article didn't matter. The work had already begun again. A new week, another broken hinge, another stranger arriving with something to fix and something to learn. Because the Whitman lane didn't need fame to stay alive. It needed use. And it had that in abundance. By the time to its final days, the festival's laughter had turned into something softer, a hum that lingered in the walls and sidewalks, the kind of after-sound only belonging makes. Lien began her mornings before sunrise now, out of habit more than duty. She'd step onto the porch in slippers, breathe in the faint sweetness of dew and pine, and let the silence test her resolve. Some mornings the world seemed unchanged, eternal. Others, it trembled like something precious but fragile. The maple was older too, branches thick with the weight of memory. Every time the wind stirred, it shed something, not just leaves but stories. You could stand beneath it and almost hear fragments. A boy learning carpentry, a woman forgiving her pride, a kettle hissing on a winter night. The light above the door still burned steady, replaced countless times, yet somehow always the same. Children called it the forever lamp. No one had the heart to correct them. One Thursday, a letter arrived addressed to the porch keeper. The envelope was pale blue, handwriting slanted and careful. Inside was a folded sheet and a small photograph. The letter read, "My name is Camilla. I live in a village near Krakow. My grandfather visited your house in 1993. He said it was the only place he ever felt like home. He told me to keep a light in my window every night no matter what. I have done so since I was 6. Now I run a shelter for women. We call it Swiatlo Domu, the House of Light. I don't know if anyone there remembers him, but I wanted you to know that the light he carried never went out." Attached was a photograph. A long wooden table, bowls of soup, women laughing, a lamp glowing in the corner, different house, same spirit. Lien placed it on the mantel beside the stool from the prison and whispered, "See, Harold? You're speaking Polish now." That night she wrote back, "We remember everyone who ever kept the light on. Thank you for keeping yours alive." Coming from Seoul. From Buenos Aires. The town's museum curator stopped by later that week. She carried a folder of papers, the kind that smelled faintly of bureaucracy. "We're planning an exhibit on civic history," she said. "We'd like to display the original trust deed and the first letter." Lien shook her head. "They don't belong behind glass. People need to touch those words." "But they'll be safer," the curator insisted. "So would kindness if we locked it up," Lien replied. The woman hesitated, then smiled. "You sound like her." "Which one?" "All of them." The curator left empty-handed but lighter. By autumn, another project began, one Lian hadn't expected. A group of college students volunteered to digitize every letter, every story connected to the Whitman Trust. They wanted to preserve the history before time weathered it away. "We'll make an archive," they said, "free for anyone who needs to remember." She let them set up in the workshop. They brought scanners, laptops, and boxes of tea. Day by day, the hum of machines joined the hum of saws and drills. Technology and tradition worked side by side, each respecting the other's rhythm. One student, a quiet girl named Sophia, stayed late each night. She had a habit of reading the letters out loud while she scanned them. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she laughed. One night, Lian found her holding a letter written by Rebecca Whitman decades ago, the one that said, "Be kind, even when you've already won." "She must have been incredible," Sophia said. "She was," Lian replied. "But so are you, or you wouldn't be here." The girl smiled, wiping her eyes. "It's strange. These people feel like family, even though they're gone." "That's how families work when you do it right," Lian said. By winter, the digital archive was live. Thousands of letters, stories, recipes, sketches, all free for anyone. The homepage simply said, "The light belongs to everyone." The launch night drew a crowd. People brought food, guitars, candles. Lian stood at the edge, watching from the porch. She could hear laughter and see faces glowing in the reflection of their phone screens, reading aloud snippets of Whitman letters that now belonged to the world. And yet, even as it all expanded into data and distance, the heart of it stayed the same. The porch light burned above her, old but steady, throwing its circle of gold onto the snow-covered boards. She whispered, "You see this, Marjorie? They turned your soup into code." The wind rustled the maple as if to say, "As long as it feeds someone, it's right." Inside, the kettle began to sing. Lian smiled, rose from her chair, and went to make tea, the only ceremony the house ever truly required. Winter held on longer than usual. The air had that clean blue stillness that made sound travel further. From the porch, Lian could hear the river 2 blocks away, restless under ice. The workshop stood quiet for the season, every tool wiped down and sleeping in order. She'd lit a small fire in the stove just for company and sat on the steps with her coat zipped to her chin. Across the street, the houses were darker than usual. Everyone had switched to solar lamps that dimmed at midnight, saving energy, saving bills. Only the porch light stayed on. It hummed in that small way metal hums when it's been doing the same honest work for too long. Lian watched its glow spread across the snow, softening the edges of everything it touched. She remembered what Marjorie used to say, "Light doesn't erase shadows, it teaches them where to stand." The memory warmed her more than the fire. By spring, the town was changing again. New faces moved in, families from cities that had grown too fast and too cold. They brought sleek cars, cautious smiles, and the kind of politeness that doesn't yet trust itself. Lian met each one on their porch, shaking hands, giving them a jar of garden jam, and saying the same thing Harold once said to a stranger at his door, "We start with tea." Some of them stayed. Some didn't. The ones who stayed learned quickly that the house with the light wasn't a museum, it was a habit. One of the newcomers was a journalist named Nora. She'd left her job in the city after writing about disasters for 10 straight years. "I got tired of counting what broke," she said. She started visiting the workshop every Thursday, notebook in hand, pretending she was just observing. But by the second week, she was fixing hinges. By the third, she'd stopped bringing her notebook. "I was trained to look for stories," she told Lian once. "But this place doesn't have stories. It has continuations." "That's what stories want to be," Lian said. "They just need a place to rest." Nora smiled. "Mind if I rest here a while?" The porch got noisier that summer. Children ran barefoot between garden beds, chasing each other with the same laughter that once belonged to Daniel's grandchildren. Volunteers came from the city every weekend, carrying groceries, lumber, or nothing at all. One day, a man arrived with a violin case and no plan. By sunset, he was playing on the porch rail, the same tune that had drifted down the lane decades earlier. Someone else joined with a harmonica, another with spoons, until music filled the air the way soup used to fill the kitchen. Lian stood at the door and thought, this is what survival sounds like. That evening, she walked through the garden after everyone had gone. Fireflies blinked among the leaves like quiet applause. The maple's roots cracked the path in gentle defiance. She touched the trunk and whispered, "They keep finding us." And the tree, steady, patient, whispered back in the only language it had ever known. As autumn returned, Nora suggested something that made the whole town pause. "Let's turn the trust outward," she said. "We have enough to maintain ourselves. Let's find the towns that don't yet have a light." Lien liked the idea but knew its risk. Growth had always been the enemy of simplicity, yet something about the timing felt right. "All right," she said. "But we don't franchise kindness. We lend it." So they began the Lantern Project. The idea was simple. Each community that had written to them would receive a box. Inside, one bulb, one switch, a copy of the first letter, and a note that said, "This is not a gift. It's an agreement." Within months, photographs started arriving. A clinic in Manila, a library in Lagos, a school in Montana. In each, the same soft circle of light fell on faces that understood. The project didn't trend online. It wasn't supposed to. But it grew anyway, quiet as sunrise. One evening, as Lien updated the ledger, she noticed something. The names of the new keepers were starting to sound familiar, even though she'd never met them. The same handwriting appeared in multiple letters. The same phrases repeated: "Use before show, keep the kettle on." It was as if the spirit of the Whitmans had learned how to reincarnate in ink. She looked at the long list, smiled, and whispered, "You found your way home again." That winter, the town council asked her to speak at the university. "They're teaching your legacy and ethics courses," the mayor said over the phone. "They call it the Whitman Principle." Lien laughed softly. Harold would have hated that. He didn't believe in principles, just practices. Still, she went. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, reporters, people curious to see if goodness could be academic. When she reached the podium, she carried nothing. No notes, no screens, just her hands. "I was asked to explain the Whitman Principle," she began. "But there isn't one. There's just this: fix what you can reach. Feed whoever's hungry. Forgive before you're asked. And keep the light on." No one clapped at first. They just said it as if realizing how much harder simplicity is than theory. Then one person began to applaud, and soon the whole room followed, but Lien only smiled faintly. She knew applause was nice. Action was better. When she returned home that night, the house was dark except for the porch. She sat beneath it, boots still wet from snow, and looked up at the bulb. "You still doing your job?" she asked. The light blinked once. She laughed softly. "Good. Don't let me down." Inside, the clock struck midnight. Another year turning, another promise kept. A few weeks later, she received a package in the mail. No return address, just a stamp smudged by travel. Inside was an old photo, black and white, of Harold sitting on the same porch, a faint smile on his face, the maple just a sapling behind him. Tucked behind the photo was a note in fresh ink. He kept it on. "Now it's your turn." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Lien placed the picture beside Marjorie's letter and Rebecca's note, and for the first time, she felt something shift in her chest. A soft certainty that everything that needed saying had already been said. The rest was just continuation. She brewed a pot of tea, filled 2 cups, set one across the table and whispered, "Still working, old man. Always will be." The kettle sighed in answer. By the time the century turned, the maple had outgrown its shadow. Its roots curled beneath the porch, thick as memory, steady as vows. The house itself leaned with age, though no one minded. The cracks in its wood were the same ones in the faces of the people who loved it, proof that endurance is just beauty's slower cousin. Lien was gone by then, her years folded gently behind her like a quilt. The workshop was run by her former apprentice, a soft-spoken man named Jonah, who'd once come here to fix a stool and stayed long enough to fix himself. He still wore her flannel apron, though the was patched and faded. When people called him the keeper, he always smiled and said, "I just keep the tea warm." The world outside was louder now. Cities ran on noise. Screens told stories faster than people could live them. Goodness had become a headline, and patience had become a luxury. Yet somehow Whitman Lane survived it all. No advertisements, no sponsors. Just the steady promise of a door that opened without questions. Jonah kept everything the way Lien had taught him. The porch light still burned every night. The kettle still whistled at 7. The shelves still carried the same wooden bowls, their edges softened by the fingerprints of half a century's worth of guests. He'd added one new ritual, though. Every evening before closing, he would stand on the steps, face the street, and read aloud from a random letter in the archive. Some nights it was Harold's first note, some nights Rebecca's apology, other nights a message from a child in another country who had never seen the house but knew exactly what it stood for. Neighbors began to gather quietly to listen. No stage, no sermon, just sentences floating through the dark like prayer. One evening as Jonah read, a storm began to gather. The sky bruised purple and gray, thunder murmured from far away. He glanced up but didn't stop. "This one's from 2025, he said. "It's from a young man who wrote, 'I used to steal until someone taught me how to repair. Turns out both take the same hands. Only one gives them back.'" The audience smiled in the dark. The wind picked up, lifting leaves from the maple. Jonah turned the page, but before he could read, the light above the porch flickered once, twice, and went out. A hush fell. He stood there for a moment, uncertain, hand frozen in the air. Then someone whispered, "It's all right. We've got phones." Small screens blinked on, one by one, pale blue light replacing gold. The storm deepened. Rain began to fall in sheets, drumming the roof like distant applause. Jonah shielded the letter and stepped closer to the door. "Stay where you are," he called. "I'll fix it." From that day on, people began leaving bulbs on the porch, single, wrapped in paper, marked with names or prayers. The fence became a line of glass gifts, each waiting its turn to shine. Years passed. Jonah grew old, his hands slower, but the work didn't need him to hurry. The house had learned how to run itself, carried forward by people who came and stayed, then left and returned again. And somewhere in that rhythm, that endless cycle of repair and renewal, the Whitman legacy became something larger than lineage. It became instinct. Now no one asked who Harold was. No one mentioned Daniel or Rebecca or Marjorie. They didn't need to. The lesson had already seeped into the bones of the town, the curriculum of its children, the rituals of its nights. On birthdays, people hung small lanterns on their doors. On anniversaries, they fixed something together instead of buying something new. And when someone died, the first thing done wasn't mourning, it was making sure the light stayed on. It wasn't a rule. It was a reflex. And in the way of all great truths, it no longer needed a name to be believed. The next decade arrived like morning mist, slowly, then all at once. The world had changed again, the kind of change that doesn't ask permission. The town had new roads, faster cars, smarter machines. People ordered everything with a thumbprint, forgot faces, remembered passwords. But every night, down that small lane the satellites ignored, one light still glowed. Jonah's hair turned the color of ash, his posture bent, but his eyes stayed young, sharp with that same quiet wonder that had lived in every keeper before him. He no longer needed to explain the porch's purpose. People arrived already knowing. They brought broken clocks, leaky radios, cracked guitar necks, and left with something far heavier repaired. Themselves. He noticed took photos anymore. They used to, snapshots of soup bowls and smiles, but now people seemed to understand that not everything worth keeping fits on a screen. Every Thursday the kettle still sang. The sound drifted past the gardens, across the lane, through the open window of the workshop where a new apprentice, a young girl named Isla, worked with sawdust in her hair and curiosity in her eyes. She asked questions no adult had the courage to. "Why do we still use nails when glue's faster?" "Because nails remember pressure," Jonah would answer. "Why do we light only one porch?" "Because it's enough." She'd think about that for hours, sometimes writing it down on scrapwood, the way children write spells. On the last day of summer, Jonah asked her to help change the bulb. He could have done it himself, but he wanted her to feel the weight of it. Together they climbed the old stool, the same one the prisoner's son had brought years ago. He steadied her hand as she turned the bulb into its socket, the glass cool against her fingers. When it clicked into place, the circle of light spilled across their faces like a benediction. "Is that it?" she asked. "That's everything," Jonah said. From that day forward, Isla was the one who kept the key. And little by little Jonah began stepping back, letting her lead the workshops, make the soup, greet the travelers who still came from all over to see what a simple light could do to a complicated world. One evening, as the town prepared for the 100th anniversary of the Whitman Trust, Isla found Jonah sitting on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket. The air smelled of rain and cedar. They want you to speak tomorrow, she said. He shook his head. They don't need speeches. They need reminders. Then at least come, she pleaded. You started this chapter. He smiled. No. The first hand that built this house started it. I just kept reading. He looked out at the lane where dozens of small lanterns now hung from every porch. The tradition had spread quietly, each family keeping their own light alive. It looked less like a street and more like a constellation come down to rest. Beautiful, isn't it? Isla said. It's not beauty, Jonah murmured. It's proof. Of what? That good doesn't die. It just changes caretakers. The next morning the crowd filled the lane, locals, travelers, children holding small candles. A brass band played a song that sounded like memory. The mayor spoke, the archivists read letters, and finally, the people turned to the porch waiting for Jonah. But the chair was empty. Inside the house on the kitchen table lay a single envelope. Isla opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a note written in Jonah's slanted script. Don't wait for me. The light's already on. And beside it, his old flannel apron folded perfectly. The ceremony continued, though quieter now. When dusk came, Isla climbed the steps alone, reached up and flicked the switch. The light came on, golden as ever, spilling across the crowd like forgiveness. A hush fell over the lane. Then a child whispered, "It's still working." And everyone smiled. That night, after the people left, Isla sat on the porch the way Jonah once did. The light hummed above her, a sound older than her lifetime. She looked out at the lane, the lamps, the laughter, the slow pulse of faith, and felt something rise in her chest like recognition. She stood, opened the front door and said softly, "You can come in now." A stray dog padded up the steps, hesitant but hopeful. She let it in, filled a bowl with soup and whispered, "That's what he would have wanted." Years later, when Isla herself had gray in her hair, the world had long stopped calling it the Whitman light. It was just the light. People used it as a verb now. "I'll light you," they'd say, meaning I'll wait up for you. "I'll believe in you. I'll keep your place warm." In schools, children drew porches instead of palaces. In offices, instead of motivational quotes. And in places too poor for electricity, fires were kept burning through the night, so no one had to be alone in the dark. The world never got kinder all at once. It never does. But it got quieter, softer, more aware that decency had a shape, the shape of a hand turning a light on for someone who might still be on their way. And on the 100th anniversary, when the last of the original maple's branches fell in a storm, the townspeople didn't mourn. They planted 5 new saplings, one in every corner of the garden. They called them the hands. Each grew differently, bending toward the porch as if remembering where to bow. That evening, the townspeople gathered again. No speeches this time. No fanfare. Just everyone standing together in the golden wash of the porch light, watching the trees sway in rhythm. And somewhere in the spaces between the leaves and laughter, it felt like Harold was there again, young, tired, patient, whispering the same thing he had written so long ago under the kitchen cabinet. "If you're reading this because I'm gone, make soup for strangers here." And they did. Because they always would. They left me at the airport after taking my house, but the deed I signed wasn't a mistake. It was a promise to a future that would never forget what a house was meant to do. To strangers who would eat where bitterness once lived. To children who would learn that love is something you leave lit, even after you're gone. Tonight on Whitman Lane the light still burns, soft, ordinary, infinite. The air hums with old stories learning to become new ones. A kettle sings in a house that belongs to everyone and no one. And somewhere, on another porch in another town, a hand reaches for a switch, flicks it gently, and whispers what the Whitmans whispered for 100 years. Keep the porch light on, because someone somewhere is still finding their way home.